All right, everybody's here because I wanted to have fun at my convention. But we're also, an entire generation is passing for us. So I want to get stories people could tell 20 years from now. And if it is only, I remember this one convention, then I think that's what was successful. Delany, Tom Purdom, both are well-known authors to me, and both personal friends. So, you know, tell a story or two, have a little bit of fun. If you want to start first, you want to go second?
I don't know. I think in deference to Age Before Beauty.
All right, Tom wrote a book that influenced my philosophy of thought on the atomic bomb. So this is one of the good reasons for him to be here.
I did that. Which book was it?
The one you wrote that you didn't acknowledge about all the inspectors running back and forth.
Oh, Reduction in Arms. Oh, you like that?
Yes.
Oh, well, that's wonderful. Thank you.
And I could only find a used copy, so I must be doing something right.
Right, yeah, I was very proud of that. But that was also the cover story of the magazine, A Fantasy and Science Fiction in August 1967. And I'm very proud of it because I got top billing over Isaac Asimov. Of course, Isaac had a monthly column, so he was always there, but I had the cover story, so I got this. Do we have to tell stories, or what do you?
Whatever you want.
As long as you don't tell the story about you swinging for the chandelier, you're on.
Okay. I just thought I was going to think about maybe filling in a little bit of the background of fandom and my background. The thing is, I started reading science fiction in 1950 when I was 14. And that was a period when science fiction was beginning to come out of the pulp ghetto, as they called it, and begin to appear in books and magazines. And it was a big upswing. It was a great time to be a science fiction reader and to discover the stuff. As for fandom, I think the way I discovered fandom was I was living in Riverview, Florida, which is 17 miles outside of Tampa and had a population of 2,000. So there weren't many science fiction fans there. But if you read the science fiction magazines in those days, in the letter columns and in the, sometimes even in ads and in the book review columns even, there was mention of fandom. So so I knew that there was a World Science Fiction Convention, and my first fanzine, does everybody know what a fanzine is?
Yeah.
Okay, hold on.
No, yeah, explain it.
Well, they were basically mimeograph magazines put out by science fiction readers, and usually sent to a couple hundred people at a time, and they were almost always mimeographed. And the science fiction fans were famous for being able to do weird, really great things with mimeograph stencils, drawing pictures on them and everything else. And they published a little fan fiction, and they also published articles about science fiction, but they also had long letter columns. And everything that you now see online in forums and everything, that all happened in the fanzines, but it was slow motion. You would write a letter, and some guy would write a reply, and his reply would have to be retyped by the editor onto the stencil, and then you would, 3 months later it would appear, and you'd get angry, and you could write a letter to him. So just about every phenomenon that you see online, including people making up special terms. My wife was the editor for a Presbyterian magazine, and she was fascinated by this. The two that she loved best were Eegaboo and Gaffy-Age. Eegaboo was like when you praised somebody, you gave them a little Eegaboo. And Gaffy-Age was getting away from it all, when the fans did that. Well, that was my contact with fandom until I got, and I actually only got one fanzine, and it was printed, called Science Fiction Time. And then in 1954, I came to Philadelphia, and at the age of 18, having dropped out of college prematurely, and that was when I made contact with the Philadelphia Science Fiction Society. And I'll just make a couple of points and then I'll share about this. The Philadelphia Science Fiction Society was basically a social club. There were other fans and fan groups that were, you know, fandom is important and we got to do big deal things. This was just a club where people got together once or twice a month and had a little meeting and then went out someplace and sat around and talked. And we were all happy with that. And about once a year we had to elect somebody president and do the chores and vice president. Nobody wanted those jobs. But after you'd been there a few years, you got got picked for it. One thing I remember was that really captured the attitude of the Philadelphia group was, I think it was sometime in the 1960s, we had several members who'd come up from Baltimore, and one year we elected 3 of them to all the offices. They were president, vice president, secretary, maybe the treasurer too, and none of us thought anything of it. But then we discovered that they were advertising this all over fandom as the Baltimore takeover of the Philadelphia science fiction. I mean, like, we'd be like, great, they want to do the work, let them do the work, you know, but to them it was a coup. And that sort of gives you the difference between Philadelphia science fiction fandom and fandom in the rest of the world. And I'll let Chip take over from there for a while.
Okay, well, I don't know whether I have anything to match that. I do remember one thing that I thought a piece of thing that I always thought was interesting, and it has affected what I wrote. It has affected the various things that I wrote. When I was a kid in elementary school, when I first read More Than Human by Theodore Sturgeon, I read it, which I read a little bit from today in the sentence. In the section on the great sentences, because I think Sturgeon's language is pretty amazing. I was in what was then called middle school library of the Dalton School, and I was standing halfway up the ladder, and I had taken this paperback, and I was reading it, and Mrs. Fisher was sitting at the desk. And Mrs. Fisher was the librarian, and she was a mother of one of the students at Dalton, and she worked at Dalton, which basically meant most of the people who went to Dalton, their mothers did not work. They were a fairly well-off group of people. Dalton was a pretty ritzy private school. We was working class black family. My father was an undertaker, who did fairly well. But anyway, the point of all of this is that one of the stories that I heard about Mrs. Fisher, and I assume that it is true, is that Mrs. Fisher had at one point done the screaming for Fay Wray in King Kong. that Mrs. Fisher had been in Los Angeles at one point and had been a secretary in the studio of Marion C. Cooper, and when Fay Wray had to scream, Fay Wray couldn't scream.
No, really?
And it's back in 1933 that we just gone from the thing from regular to talkies. Regular movies, that's the kind without words, to talkies. And so Mrs. Fisher had been called in to do the scream. I've seen this. Obviously, this has become some kind of thing with in Hollywood in general, because in a couple of Brian De Palma films, a version of this is used. So it's become some kind of what do you call it? Some kind of myth that someone was brought in to do some screaming for another actress and what have you. Well, Mrs. Fisher was the first person who did this, and I refer to this incident in a science fiction novel of mine called Through the Valley of the Nest of Spiders. Somebody did. I also remember stories that, for instance, Judy Merrill told me about things that had happened to her a long time ago. Judy Merrill used to be married to Fred Pohl, and we became fairly good friends fairly early. I knew very little about science fiction fandom. My first editor who was the editor-in-chief of Ace Books, was Fred Pohl, who never occurred to him to introduce me to science fiction fandom. In fact, I don't know whether he thought that it wouldn't be very good for me, or something, or wouldn't be, or Judy, she said no. She said Fred. She said Don Walheim. I'm sorry, Don Walheim. She said probably had less social skills than anybody I've ever known. You know, she said I don't think he was doing it on purpose. I don't think he was doing it out of racism or anything else. I just think it never occurred to him.
You might have thought you knew about it too.
Or obviously I didn't know about it. It was very clear because I was in and out of his office and I never said anything about it. And you know, and so, but anyway, but she told the story. She told the story of how, at one point when she was going with Walter Miller, can't afford Cole Leibowitz, but Walter Miller, and she'd been married to Fred, and Fred came after them. In somewhere in northern Florida with a shotgun.
Really?
And was running it, and she said, and the two of them, Walt and Fred, began to wrestle with one another over the shotgun. She said, Fred really didn't know that the shotgun was not loaded. But he was really, which she thought was very brave of him, to wrestle this guy over a shotgun. And she said, and her own self-description was very, very, she said, and there I was screaming like a ninny, take it outside, take it outside, take it outside. Yeah. So I remember this, I remember this whole thing. And she also, another moment that she conveyed to me, and it's a charming moment, I think. And she said that she went once at one point when she and Walt were lying in bed. Walt said to her, "We are both marvelous performers. Do you think we will ever perform for anyone else?" Which is a line that stayed with me from Judy telling the joke. I've never felt that way, but anyway. And so all of these things, all of these off. This is why I'm a sexual radical. So that stays with it. I remember she also told me at one point that she said, explained that the best sex she'd ever had was when she indeed was in her late 60s, which I thought was a nice thing to know. And I thought, now that I am in my middle 70s, I wonder if there's any hope for me. But things are going pretty well for me, even now, on that front. I tend to, if you want to tell stories, the stories have to be, I think, the things that you're not likely to, to write about. So I hope some of you remember these. And I hope if somebody is ever doing a biography of Judy Merrill, she's put some of these in her own reminiscences. Oh, look.
Well,
sushi.
One thing one could say about, so I take over for a bit? One thing one could say about science fiction fandom when I started was that it was very male. And the first time, I sort of drifted toward the Philadelphia Science Fiction Society. I won't explain that, but I think the first science fiction Philcon I went to was 55. And you got to remember, 100 people was considered a very good crowd at those things. And it was almost all male. I don't remember any women being there. One thing I always remember is, you got to remember I was about 18 or 19 and going to something like this for the first time from small towns. And well, anyway, in those days, most people smoked cigarettes. Everybody smoked. Most people smoked cigarettes, except for intellectuals who smoked pipes. So in a group, you might find one person who smoked a pipe and 5 or 6 other people. What I remember is walking into the meeting room, and there was this group of about half a dozen men and standing around, and they all turned around to see who was coming in, and every one of them had a pipe. Just the sight of 5 or 6 guys all with pipes, it was a really good thing. And at that particular one, the only other thing I remember is that L. Sprague Camp gave a very good talk on the ether war, which was the great battle over who invented ether, which he had been writing about. And he ended that story by letting us know that one of them died of apoplexy because he read an article giving credit to the other one. And that was it. And it was true, too, that the Science Fiction Society was mostly male. We had one female member who was single named Peggy Gordon. And I can remember now and then we would go someplace after a meeting for pizza. And when Peggy reached out and let us put a cigarette in her mouth, this little bonfire would appear under the 6 guys reaching to light her cigarette for her, you know. And the thing I have noticed is, looking back, that was in those days everybody wished there were more women fans. Now, many times at science fiction gatherings, we have all these women fans, and I look around and all the guys are still talking to each other. So, I mean, what can you do about that? I don't know. So that is about all I can tell you about sex and fandom as I observed it. The only other point I might make is that somehow by 1957, when I sold my first story, I also ended up being in charge of Philcon, probably because nobody else wanted to volunteer. And in those days, for some reason, science fiction conventions had gotten locked into talking about flying saucers. And one of the great irritations was that it was assumed by the news media that science fiction fans were always going to be interested in flying saucers. And if you're at a science fiction convention, they might even say in the headline, "Saucer fans meet at such and such a place." And I thought we should get away with that. And I actually scheduled a Philcon where it was all about science fiction. We even interviewed a couple of writers. We had writers talk about science fiction. And somebody came up to me and told me we had a new slant on this. And so I kept staying in charge. I want to talk just a little bit. 57, 59, but then, 58. 59 I was away because I got drafted. And then while I was in the Army, I planned the ultimate Philcon. And first of all, Theodore Sturgeon was to be the guest of honor. And we would have speeches by Avram Davidson and L. Sprague Camp. And there were 2 or 3 others. And it would be a 2-day convention, the first one. And I came back and I organized it and we did it. That was exactly the way it played. And Sturgeon gave a wonderful speech. And we got 135 people, which was a new record for the Philcon. So your turn now.
Is that a question there?
I want to know, did they bring their children to these things, or families, or?
You really didn't have much in the world. I think if the appearance of, there probably might be like one person there with a child or something, but it was, you know, it was very rare. Seeing children and lots of women at cons really didn't start until maybe the late 60s, I would say.
I can remember, excuse me, good sushi. I can remember going to Charlie Brown's house in New York, in the Bronx, and helping him mimeograph up this little magazine called Locus. It was a mimeograph thing stapled just like any other fanzine. Charlie was fairly heavy, but he was nowhere near as heavy as he eventually became. I do remember, you know, helping him with that, and helping mail out Locus and what have you. And then he went over to the West Coast, and Locus became the magazine we all know and love, the magazine of the science fiction community. And at the same time, David Hartwell used to publish a poetry magazine called The Little Magazine. And the Little Magazine also metamorphosed over the 60s into the New York Review of Science Fiction, which of course was a parody of the New York Review of Books. It was interesting to watch all these things get bigger and larger, and then finally and then Charlie became so heavy, but eventually that he would fly back and forth to Puerto Rico, and eventually died on a plane returning home from Puerto Rico, largely just from his own. I think that was just. I don't know whether he had diabetes or anything like that. That I'm not sure. He may have, but I think just his weight had just become just.
Yeah.
You know,
Didn't he
I
go
think the
through a
term is-
period when he was a runner though, and he slimmed down? I think he did.
Did he? I don't know that.
In early years, he actually was almost a doppelganger for a younger Orson Welles.
Oh, okay.
Really?
He
Yeah.
took some pictures of him, and, first one I looked at like that, I actually thought, what would this is in the photos I got, and then I realized it was Charlie. But he actually looked much like Orson Welles.
Yeah. Yeah. So, there you go. Are there any questions? I think that questions might be appropriate of this. I started publishing early, but I didn't get into science fiction fandom. I didn't get to my first science fiction convention until 1966, at the Tricon in Cleveland. No, and where I met Roger Zelazny and various people, and met John W. Campbell. Much to my not that we ever became, but I mean I saw him, and I had met some English science people. I had already come back from Europe, for my first trip to Europe, which I took between writing a novel called Babel 17 and another novel called Nova, and I'd gone out over to Europe and come back. And I'd stopped off in England, and I had met John Brunner and Brian Aldiss and Michael Moorcock, and all of which changed my life. Those meetings of the people in Europe were if anything, the thing that kind of these were people who would be associated with the new wave. As things went on, and that's one of the reasons why I got associated with it. I was never a member of it. I wanted very much to be, but I wasn't doing the kind of thing that Michael Moorcock really liked at that particular point. He wanted things that were near future and politically very much aware.
In which case, take one or two and pass one.
So anyway,
I wanted to, you made me think a couple of things. I have a story about him, which he probably never remembers because I think I told it to him once. I think it was about 1966 that he came to a Philcon. That was my memory. At that time, I'd been hearing about him for some time, people telling me he was the up-and-coming writer and all that. And I think it was after you'd won your first Hugo. That's right, and I told him that I'd been hearing about him for several years, and he was amazed. He said, but I hadn't won any Hugos before then or anything. And that made me aware of just how an author can have all kinds of readers and impact and never know it. There's that big audience out there that you rarely have contact with. I myself had a kind of parallel career with both fandom and science fiction, writing science fiction, which went on together. Sometimes people say you start as a fan and you become a writer, but the truth is it's just easier to become a fan than a writer, and the club was here. In the 60s, I was pretty active in organizing Philcon, and I was usually the MC. And that made me think of one of my more memorable moments as an MC. We had a panel in which several writers were supposed to talk about their most memorable, what they thought the most memorable thing they had read in science fiction. And sitting there, I thought, oh, I know how to introduce these guys. And so I said, and now we have so-and-so, who was the author of such memorable works as, and this one who was the author of such, and then I got to Keith Laumer, and the author of such, and I blanked. And I actually had a book in mind. I think it's Plague of Demons. I could see it, but I could not remember the title, and I'm standing there frozen. And suddenly I hear this deep voice at the end of the panel saying, a memorable author, that being Keith, of course. You know. Well, the next year, Keith was the principal speaker, as we call it here. We don't have a guest of honor. And he'd had his stroke by then, so he was, he was having fun, but he was good. He made a great principal speaker. And so what I did was, I got somebody to make up cards with the name of every Keith Laumer book on it. There was about 30 or 40 by then. And I handed them out to the people in the first 3 or 4 rows, and I said, now, to the first person, I said, now when you hear the signal, I go like this, you should stand up and read what's on your card. The next person said, when he stands up and reads his, then you follow and read his, and down the line, then you get up, and then when he gets up, so everybody knew what they were supposed to do. And so then I introduced Keith. Then I told him, told this story of how I'd forgotten, from the last card. And I said, and so now I wish to introduce Keith Laumer, the author of such works as, and then I sort of sat there, once again frozen, and then I gave the little signal, and the people started jumping up, and it made a great way to introduce him.
Yeah. Well, Tom, the way I became aware of Tom is because we were on opposites.
Yeah, right.
One of the things we shared an ace double.
That's right.
And Tom had written a book called The Tree Lords of Imiton.
That's what it was called when Don changed the title.
What was the original title?
My title was from Shakespeare, A Man Can Die But Once.
A Man Can Die But Once, which became The Tree Lords of Imiton. And I had a book called Empire Star on the other side, which was a book that I had just written, actually just after Babel 17, but got published just before it, which screwed up my bibliography for people for years and still does sometimes. If I get to look at the book, if I get to arrange the book page, what they call the book page, where the list of books that the person has written, I put Empire Star after Babel 17, but if other people will sometimes put it before. But it was very nice to have that, and that's how I first knew Tom here, who is a mere. I think, what are you, 6 years older than I am?
I was born in 36. What are you, 41?
Huh? I'm 42.
42, yeah, well, yeah, 6 years.
Yeah, 6 years, right. Yeah.
That's right, 6 and 12 is 6. Right.
Yeah. So that's how that let's see.
Let's see, I know, man. I found that, I feel maybe people might be interested in how Philcon grew. Maybe I'm wrong. The last one I think that I really had anything to do with was the one in 1969, which of course was the anniversary of the year of the first landing on the moon. In fact, Apollo 12 left for the moon while we were having the con, which gave us something. And Bob Silverberg was supposed to be the principal speaker that year, but he decided he had too many things to do and told us he couldn't come. So Anne McCaffrey became the principal speaker, and
the first woman to win a Hugo.
But she really, that's interesting. I didn't know she was the first woman to win a Hugo.
Yes.
Good. Well, the thing that I was told was that Silverberg did come to the con. He just didn't feel he could. And when he saw that Anne was speaking to this big ballroom with 250 people in it, somebody said his face just turned pale or something. He really realized that he had lost what was then would have been a big event. Today,
Yeah. Anne and I were actually fairly good friends at one point, and Anne also had a beautiful voice. She also she was a singer, trained as a singer before she was trained as before she became a writer, and she really sang extraordinarily well. She lived out in Glen Cove, Long Island, right? And I remember going out and sitting on her porch and talking to her. And she was writing a series of novels about dragons, and they were science fiction novels. They were not. It was interesting about science fiction novels about dragons rather than fantasy novels about dragons, and about a world where there were white dragons and there were different kinds of dragons, and then eventually moved to Ireland. where she basically moved because of the tax situation. You know, because you could get a better, you know, better tax rate. So we didn't see each other in the last parts of her life because she.
Yeah, the tax thing was that the first $20,000 you earned as a writer were not taxed. He did that to attract writers and artists. I thought it was.
And that's when you could live on $20,000
right,
a year,
right,
especially in Ireland.
Yeah, right. And so I did talk to her. I had my contact with Anne was mostly through Science Fiction Writers of America, where I caught through the banquets and other things. And she was the secretary treasurer of SFWA when we first had it, for 2 or 3 years there. In fact, I had to run again. We had this weird thing in SFWA, but which we all approved of, though. When David asked for revisions to the bylaws he had sent out, someone said they felt that they wanted a provision in the bylaws that every candidate for office had to make a statement. And there had to be 2 candidates for office. That was it. And their reason given was, I'm tired of belonging to organizations in which a nominating committee picks the officers and the rest of us vote for them.
Right.
So we all agreed with that. And so there were lots of nice little things written by people in their statements of why they should hold office. I always liked the one Silverberg wrote, in which he concluded by saying that one of his qualifications was, I have never seduced the wife of a paid-up member. And you know, that sentence depends upon the word paid up. I think that's the critical thing. Well, anyway, I got the job of running as a token candidate against Anne McCaffrey and for secretary treasurer. And I spent about 2 months being scared to death that something might go wrong and I would get elected. And then when I only got 3 votes, I spent 6 weeks feeling I should have gotten more. That didn't seem right.
Right. Did you ever? I don't remember you at any of the Milford science fiction.
No,
conventions.
I never went to Milford. Damon invited me, but it just wasn't something I felt like I could get to. And,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. But I was the vice president of SFWA for 2 years. I had a fair amount of contacts and saw what the. Yes, I also, one of the surprises of being an officer in SFWA was to discover how much all these people cared about the awards. That really threw me, because we had writers, you know, with the Hugos for the first 20 years, it seemed like they went to writers who were already recognized. Everybody knew who the important writers were in science fiction, so who cared if you got an award? It didn't. And then we started the Nebulas, and I discovered that at every Nebula banquet afterward, the people would sit around discussing what the rules should be, because the rules hadn't led to them winning.
Really? Is that how it worked?
Yeah, it really did. I mean, the fact that they cared so much. These were people I've been reading since I was a kid, and the fact that the idea of winning a Nebula was important to them really threw me.
Well, of course, the Nebula and the Hugos work very different, which is to say, and I'm sure you all know basically what the difference is that the Nebulas are voted on by the writers, and the Hugos are voted on by the fans. And so there is I think when the whole thing was a little smaller, there was perhaps, because I don't know, because I didn't get a Hugo until well after I had gotten a Nebula, and that somehow that the Hugos were kind of popularity contests, which is one of the reasons that the Nebula Awards were started, because they're feeling that maybe people who were a little bit more in touch with the creative process per se might make better judges, would make a different kind of judge or a better judge. I think at the time they thought it would be better. They thought it would be better, and maybe perhaps it was.
Well, the big weakness with the Nebulas is that the writers don't read as much science fiction. You know, I mean, if you're a writer, you got all kinds of other things you should be reading, and so, you know, so getting a bunch of writers to make a judgment on this, I think, was always a problem. And we went. Well, maybe I should tell them the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to me.
There you go.
It was at a Nebula banquet that I was in charge of. And we had there's always been a no award on the for each category. You can vote no award. And in that year, we were still with these rules that whatever got the most votes. Now you had 5 stories and a no award. So the votes would be distributed, between 6 different possibilities. And so, and no award happened to win in the short story category. And Isaac was doing the master of ceremonies, and he was going to give out the awards, or announce them. And I think 4 of the awards were being given in the West Coast. And so I gave him the list, and it said, short story, no award, number 1. And I thought that was okay. It didn't occur to me I should say anything more to him. And he got up, and in all good faith, he announced that Gene Wolfe had won the short story award for his story, The Island of Dr. Death. And I then had to get up, we're both at the head table and going, and he said, I thought that was a joke. And that just had not occurred to me. And it really was an embarrassing moment. And of course, a friend of mine pointed out, Gene Wolfe, for about 1 minute, thought he had won a Nebula. And then we snatched it away from him, and that was horrible. The whole thing was horrible.
Right.
But it was just one of those things. But the next year, Gene Wolfe did get a Nebula for the short story, and so. But the Nebula banquets were famous for something going wrong like that every banquet for at least the first 10 years.
Yes. I can remember Harlan. Getting at one point when it was in the West Coast, when there was a Nebula Award banquet on the West Coast, getting an award and coming off the stage and just furiously kicking the side because he was so mad that he'd gotten the award and he didn't want to get the award. Which was a strange thing. It was the same year that I got an award. I was perfectly happy to get mine, but that's possibly because I was younger. Although the second year I got an award, I was not so happy to get it because I was going through a very rough time with both my wife and the world in general, and I had only convinced her to come because the previous year when I got my first Nebula Award, David Knight had sent me a letter saying, "Are you going to be there?" Well, somehow the planning of the banquet passed on to different people in some way, and so I said, well, look, you don't have to worry about coming. I have not gotten an award this year because I didn't get a letter. I'm sure they would have sent me a letter saying, making sure you're going to come, and I didn't get a letter. So that year, of course, I got 2 Nebula Awards, and my wife was furious. She just said, because she'd come only on the occasion that so it was a very strange thing, and I also was the subject of a very strange speech by Fred Pohl, basically explaining to the entire SFWA that they had been very stupid to vote the Nebula Awards to the people to whom they had awarded them to, and there had been, and Robert Silverberg was the chairman, was the what is the word I am looking for? It was the master of ceremonies. Yes. And after Fred's speech about how stupid the entire organization was.
Oh, wait, Fred did this as a speech?
Yes, he did this as an after-dinner speech. And everybody was sort of, everybody was, the first, I thought, what about all this work with literary pretensions and abandoning the conventions of good old-fashioned storytelling, and meanwhile people are basically looking back and forth between me and Fred in the banquet, and I'm like, why? And I thought he couldn't be talking about me, could he? Well, I'm the one who'd written this book called The Einstein Intersection that was filled with epigraphs from fancy literary things and what have you, and so. At the end, I had already gotten the Nebula Award for the novel, and then Fred made this speech, and I am thinking, what did I do to deserve this? I just wrote some, and then finally, the applause was very slight. Fred finished his speech, and there was like, and nobody really applauded. And then Robert Silverberg had said, "Well, I guess he told us, I guess he told us what he thought. He thought we were all idiots." And then I won for short story. I thought, oh, for God's sake. This is and so with the sweat streaming down the back of my neck under my tux, this was, I walked up and I thought, well, I have to say something. So I said, well, I write the stories I do. I work on them as hard as I can, and that you've chosen to honor them twice in one night. I'm very warmed, and then I walked back, and I'm walking back, and I'm passing the table where Virginia Kidd and Isaac Asimov are both sitting. And Virginia Kidd very kindly reaches over and she says, "Chip, that was elegant." And I thought, what? And then Isaac Asimov reaches over at the other hand and he says, "We only did that because you're Negro." which I hold against him, not at all. I really don't, because I think he was doing it and evoking a kind of masculine thing, which was okay then, where you say exactly the opposite of what you think.
Of course.
Where
he's Jewish too, so.
Right. Yes. And so I don't. As I said, good for him. But it was a very strange. It was a very, very strange evening, and something. It tells you how the world was very, very different then from the way it is now. Nobody, I don't think, would say that sort of thing today to a to a young black woman. James Blish in a book review had described me as a merry Negro.
Oh, good God. Most people didn't even know that I knew, didn't even know that you were black.
Yes, well, the people who had met me more than once, the word got around.
Yeah, right. But as far as readers go.
Yeah, but no, I was as far as Jim Blish, and I remained friends with Jim Blish and his entire life. But I was a merry Negro.
I went through that, not that experience, but a similar experience with Lester Del Rey. I think it was the first year I was vice president, and Gordy Dixon, so I had taken on with the idea that science fiction, and we did have a couple of reporters there, and it took an awful lot of work, and what happens, but Lester Del Rey was the after dinner, so far, all of it. Actually, it was clear he was aiming it at me. And
a little while ago, you talked about, you mentioned Roger Zelazny, used by fans.
Absolutely.
And you were made an agreement with each other to sign one of each other's books. You were allowing him to sign, I think, he signed Persephone, and he was allowing you to sign Dream Master.
Dream Master.
Can you know more about that?
Well, it was we used 10 words long. This title is 10 words, and it's which is quite the last. And we used to play that kind of one.
You wouldn't allow him to sign what?
Not sure what that's referring to, but I thought Roger was probably the most of his early novels. I think when he got into the Amber world, those early long story short novels, there are 10 of them that are just some of them.
You had mentioned earlier about not being. I did want to ask.
For the first up until 1966, I had already published 8.
Sure.
Before I went to a science fiction.
In the 60s and I guess maybe into the early 70s, you had done some work for Terry Carr's fanzine, Lighthouse.
Yes.
What got you started, and if you could tell us a little bit about the motivation for some of those articles, because those were literally famous. There's only one?
That's only.
I thought there was 2, but okay.
Possibly, but I can only.
But it was a. Everyone considered it at the time that it was an incredibly dramatic and motivating piece, even to other writers.
Well, well, first of all, Terry was a young editor, and he had his own. She'd been doing well before he came to. And he kind of inherited me as a writer, and I think, and I was very, very fond of it. I thought his early death was really tragic. The problem, I think, was for the entire science fiction. He would have gone on to do the way science fiction often took its editor, the same way when they had a little press called Ansatz Press, and indeed somebody that I met at the very first science fiction in Ohio, Zirconia Press, the book of mine.
Cherry was my roommate back.
Still in touch with him?
Yes.
Okay, say hello, please please say hello to him. I'm still very, very fond of
Be
Jerry
glad to.
and Susan. So, so all of these things were together in a way. And as I said, Jerry was, I think, maybe led me around. Knew he'd read, and I was, and so he took me. I was in bathroom tongues, and he was the 14-year-old person who'd been coming to science fiction for 3 or 4 years, and here was an older writer who knew nothing about the whole thing, so he was going to show me around, and it was wonderful. I'm glad he did.
Thoughts I've had on fandom. Don Wollheim once said that writing for fanzines didn't feel at ease in print. Which I think is a wonderful statement, and a lot of people, when they go to write, they freeze up, especially if they know, but you feel comfortable in print. And one of the things I've noticed is that not all fans become science fiction writers, but fandom produces of large numbers of people, do anyway, who go into things like public relations and journalism and so on.
Right.
And writing steadily for fanzines, for audience, the real thing if you're going to be a writer is write for audiences and write a lot. And I've often felt that the way I would teach writing, if I were going to teach it in a college or something, is have the class put out the equivalent of a fanzine, writing for each other, with a teacher more as a guide or a coach than as somebody who tells them what to do and gives them assignments, so that you really get that feedback from an audience. The other thing I've often said about fandom is that if you want to plan any kind of an event, you practically have a lot of people in fandom who are practically professional event planners at this point. And I think one of the things it shows is that because the Nebulas be planned by, quote, the professionals, because the SFWA bulletin and publications were supposed to be by professionals, people often expected them to be better than fan product, but often they weren't. And as I believe what's happened is now that fan groups for the Nebulas the same way they banquets, the same way they do for the, and with the fans being in charge of organizing the thing and so on, they're probably much better run. Because writers are not the right people to do this kind of thing, and that's it. And if you look at there have been long periods when they were actually edited by somebody. Any more questions?
No.
I'm not sure what you want us to talk about.
You got 15 more minutes.
We got what?
You got 15 more minutes. Keep
Well,
going.
somebody asked a question. It's hard to know what you want us to talk about.
Sir, are you a turtle?
That was, who was it used to say that? Shepard?
Yeah.
Well, actually, several of them.
Oh, okay.
Sure, actually asked it over the open
Oh,
net.
with Shiraz, yeah.
Yeah,
Right.
he asked it over the open net while they were still in space.
Right.
I was there, working there, and he came back and had to buy 300 drinks for people in the room.
How did that work? You said, "Sir, are you a turtle?" And if you didn't
Bet
answer-
your sweet ass I am.
Oh, yeah. That's right. Yeah. Obviously, they were all fine.
It was pretty organized in England by the time. By the time I got to England, by the time I got to England, there was the first time I was taken out to a pub where science fiction fans met. That was in London. John Brennan took me to a club where science fiction fans met.
I think the British and the Americans, I think it was all post-World War II. I don't know when it got started, but the English-speaking countries would, of course, be the ones who would be most likely to spread first. I think it would mostly be post-World War II.
I got my first. And Frank Herbert brought it back from Heidelberg to give
Oh,
it to
that's
me.
even classier.
And he was a lovely guy, and a very, very nice and generous fellow.
The closest I ever got to a Nebula was I got to carry around Catherine McLean's the year she was. I was in charge of making sure she got it.
I still think, by the way, that Catherine McLean has now gotten a grandmastership of justice. I mean, she's still alive.
Still alive?
Yeah, she's still alive.
Yeah.
And she was one of the writers from whom I learned how to write.
In ReaderCon about 4 or 5 years ago, I got to talking to Catherine McLean, whom I never really met, and I had really admired her work from the beginning. And one thing I admired about her, liked about it, was her style. She had such control. You know, there's this feeling you get with a really good writer, they're in control of the language, everything that's happening, and that's what you want. And she said that to something about she didn't think she was a very good writer or something. I said, what, that's... And for some reason, Chip was going to introduce her, and I didn't know his feelings about her. And I said to her, and I went up and she was talking to her, and I said, you know, Chip, she doesn't think she's a very good writer. And then I found out that for years, he mentioned this, and he learned to write from reading her, right?
The Diploids, now she didn't write a lot of stories. She
Yeah.
didn't, but the Diploids is an amazing collection of stories. There's nothing in it what she won the Nebula Award for.
Yeah, that was the one I carried around.
Right. You know, and she was very much a part of the science fiction, especially in the 30s and 40s, and then kind of drifted away from it because it wasn't really giving her anything back. She was very close friends with, but and a very lively person. And I, as I said, I realized I would still. How do you go about starting a movement of the Grand Mastership that fucking well deserves? You know, because while they don't give Grand Masterships, you know, and so she's what is she? She's in her 90s now, and I think we should, you know, is there any one, you know, who are the big name fans to talk about, huh? To talk about.
Or at least,
Yeah, I don't think that's a fannish thing. I don't think that's a fannish thing. That's a SFWA.
Well, but there is one award she could be given, and that is to be the guest of honor at the Worldcon, which most writers think is the ultimate award in the field, I think. Because that shows that you really have such an appeal. They pick you because you have a big appeal you're going to draw a big audience, and fans want to see you and meet you. And that's a lifetime
I had
tribute.
mine in '96. That's when I was the guest honor.
Yeah, it's like the Nobel Prize of science fiction. It's a lifetime tribute.
Although now I think things like the Grand Master feel closer than.
Oh yes, right.
Feel closer to something. Yeah.
Couldn't give her that, but she not draw the audience up.
Didn't you said that she was writing less? Was she writing in other areas? Continue?
No, I think she kind of drifted away from writing in general. Still a lively, wonderful, and it was great to interview. I interviewed
That's
her
right.
I think it was at WizCon?
It was a ReaderCon.
ReaderCon.
Yeah, I remember that.
And I know I once interviewed Joanna Russ by phone.
Oh, I hope those were recorded.
If it was a ReaderCon, it was recorded. Everything was ReaderCon was recorded. And I have no idea what happened to it. What somebody has been recording stuff at ReaderCon for years, and you know, and where it goes is some archive somewhere,
One of my memories of Philcon, very personal, the subject of creativity came up, and I was then the father of a young something about, and also if you're a writer, people often will say, "Joe, it must be so wonderful to be." And I was standing next to Joanna, and some others came up, and I said, "The people all keep coming up to you and saying how wonderful it must be to do creative work." It's worth coming to a con sometimes just for one moment like that.
Yes. That's very good. I like that.
I was able to come on a semi-regular basis because this was.
Well, thank you very much, both of you.